1969 was the year that the first human set foot on the moon, saying it was a small step for man, but a giant leap for mankind. It was also the year that the Beatles performed their last live performance on the roof of the Apple building in London. From August 15th to the 18th of 1969, an improbable music festival occurred, drawing up to 500,000 enthusiastic young fans to the fields of a startled dairy farmer named Max Yasgur in upstate New York. The 3 days of peace and love that became known as Woodstock would go down in history as one of the most iconic music events of the year and of the decade and possibly even of that century. In Nigeria in 1969, a brutal fratricide that became known as the Biafra War was underway that left up to 1 million people dead, but preserved Nigeria's fragile unity. 1969 is the year that Golda Meir became the Prime Minister of Israel. It is the year the Boeing 747 aircraft made its debut. Also, the first ATM machine was installed in the USA. A magnitude 6.3 earthquake occurred, the largest ever in South African history, very near this very spot in 1969, killing 7 people. Another earthquake-like event happened in 1969, one that was to have enormous implications for us even today. That was the year that the first ever computer-to-computer link was established by ARPANET, which was the precursor to what we affectionately know as the Internet. In 1969, a young Foreign Service officer from the US State Department's Office of Overseas Schools named Paul Lubke called together a small group of educators in Accra, Ghana, for an informal series of meetings which would eventually lead to the creation of the Association of International Schools in Africa. Meanwhile, in the fall of 1969, a young woman sat on the stoop of her 3rd floor walk-up apartment in Washington, D.C., awaiting the birth of her first child. When Peter approached me a couple of years ago with the idea to write a book about AISA, I was pleased and honored to be approached about that. The idea of writing a book has long been a dream of mine. I thought I was going to write a towering book of fiction like Joyce Carol Oates, or maybe a moneymaker like J.K. Rowling's. But this dream has been fading out for a long time. And the more I thought about it, this book about AISA was the book I was intended to write. It was more realistic for me, and it had a better chance of touching people who had some of the same experiences that I have had over the years. So I was happy to dive into the project. Peter told me that this speech should be a joyous recounting of the process of writing the book, and certainly I will try to make it joyous, but it wasn't joyous every day. And at the very least, however, it was a deeply satisfying process. I will add here that it was also a very personal project for me, having participated in some of this history myself. And knowing some of the cast of characters, it was lovely to remember them all and interact with many of them in the process. As Rob Ambrogi has stated so eloquently in his story about his own journey in the book, the history of AISA also tracks my own family and professional story through the years. I attended my first AISA conference in about 1982, before some of you were born, when I was working as a school counselor in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I knew very little about the organization, but I relished the opportunity to attend a conference, to travel, to learn something, and yes, to go shopping. My personal journey with AISA started there 37 years ago. Luckily for me and for the project, we benefited from the doctoral dissertation of Dr. Charles Kite, the second AISA executive director. After 4 years in Kenya, when he first worked with AISA, Chuck and his family left Africa to return to the United States for graduate studies at the University of South Carolina, where our own Connie Buford was working. And he eventually wrote his doctoral dissertation about the history of AISA for its first 17 years, and it was finalized in May of 1989. We are very grateful to have been able to reference his work for this book, and even more grateful to Chuck for his energy and devotion to the organization in its early years. Even though he was never a full-time employee of AISA, I think it was only supposed to be 25% of your time, he nevertheless accomplished so much in creating a vision for the organization, developing a means of communication through the newsletters and various written documents that he left, and establishing AISA as a viable organization from the very beginning. I was able to access not only Chuck's dissertation itself, but many newsletter articles and other documents he left in the AISA archives. And he's already been introduced, but I'd like to ask him and his wife Yuri to stand and for us to thank him very much for his work. Just a note about the research process, and I learned a lot about doing research, writing this book. At first, I couldn't find Chuck. After contacting several older friends and friends of friends, I did find a working email address for him and found out he was living in Japan, where I started this process. And ironically, he had a retirement home in the US, which is about an hour's drive from my own home in Portland, Oregon. So I was able to connect with him and have a lovely afternoon. Next, I started looking for Paul Lubke, who was the original man from the Office of Overseas Schools who had the idea to start an organization of African educators. I couldn't find him anywhere or anyone who knew anything about him. I did find somebody who attended the first AISA conference. His name is Jim Gilson, and I was able to meet with him. He remembered Paul Lubke being there all those years ago, but he didn't know anything about where he is now. After much nagging of people in the Office of Overseas Schools, and with apologies to Tom Shearer, it seemed like I went through a time where I was calling him every other day. There were no archives to check, no photos, and no address for him or a relative. I consulted everyone I knew. I started combing through obituaries to see if he was even still alive, and I couldn't find anything. So I was ready to give up. Luckily, I also am a bit of an insomniac. So in one of those middle of the nights, I can't sleep hours of boredom, I started Googling his name with different combinations of words like educator, international school, diplomat, Africa, etc. And up popped an article that was written by someone named Theo Lubke about the International School of Kuala Lumpur. Well, Lubke is not that ordinary a name, and a Lubke associated with an international school had to be more than a coincidence. So I wrote my friend in Kuala Lumpur, Norma Hudson, and she didn't know anything about the article, but she found someone who did. And suddenly I had an email address for Theo Lubke. I wrote to him, explained my mission, and within a week I had a response from him. Well, he is Paul Lubke's grandson, and Paul himself was in an assisted living facility in Durham, North Carolina. Furthermore, Theo told me that he was in the process of going through Paul's old archives from when he worked abroad, and suddenly I had a wealth of information about his life and also some photos of him, which you will find in the book. At this point, I felt like I had a good idea about the first 17 years of AISA's history, and it was obviously quite the adventure. The organization's initial years were obviously and understandably full of growing pains, but the attraction felt by schools and the need for teachers and administrators to get together, to come together, to share ideas, and to support one another was obvious. So the organization all began to take shape. I next needed to figure out AISA's trajectory into the next 20 years or so. I was keenly aware of some of the activities and events that happened, and I returned to Africa myself from Indonesia in 1992 when I met Peter, and I became actively involved again, eventually joining the AISA board in 1998. However, there were many holes in my knowledge and memory, especially in my memory, and in the process of filling those in, I began to understand the organization better than I ever had before. Next, Peter and I discussed how to best access the archival material that was physically located in the AISA office in Nairobi, stashed away in shelves and filing cabinets and cardboard boxes in no particular order. One of the best decisions we made along then was to hire a research assistant named Faith Gittel. And she came in and went through all of the archives and figured out what was important, digitized everything, and sent it to me. And if you will look on the inside covers of the book, those of you may not have had a chance to look at it yet, the inside covers of the book actually have the images of all of the programs from AISA conferences since the beginning of the organization. So if you hadn't had a look at those yet, I'm sure those of you who have been attending conferences will recognize some of them. So we owe a debt of thanks to Faith for all of her very hard work in getting all of those things sent to me. AISA was fortunate in the leadership of two very dynamic, and I should say, like me, Southern women who worked with the organization from the years of 1988 to 2009. Those were the years in which AISA consolidated itself and its reputation as an organization that facilitated communication among and beyond African schools. And they planned excellent conferences. They started the tradition of these lovely conferences and other programs for the benefit of educators in international schools. The first of these, who served from 1988 to 1997, is Dr. Connie Buford, whom we are so delighted to have with us this evening. Connie, stand up. And Connie is here with her husband, Charlie Gottlieb. Charlie, you can also have a little bow here. Yeah. The second, whom we are also honored to have with us this evening, is Miss Greer, who served from 1997 to 2009. And Bonnie, she is here tonight with her cousin, Bonnie Colton. So Miffy, can you stand up and take a bow? In 50 years of its life, AISA has only had 6 executive directors, and we have 4 of them in the room tonight, so this is really a big thrill. Both of these women loved AISA and loved Africa, and with a great passion. And more importantly for the organization, both of them left a large body of written documentation from their years of work there, so we were able to access all of that. Some of what Miffy and Connie wrote was funny, reflecting the hardships and unexpected events that happened as they do. And such as one year we had to cancel the 2 AISA conferences at the last minute due to the Gulf War. And Connie and Miffy, the consultants were already en route. They were already in the air. And the conference, when they landed, they found out the conference was canceled. But when you read the book, you will see what happened next, and that is that there was a lot of improvisation, and they kind of reconstituted a mini conference, and anyway, they made it all work. So this is kind of what we do, as Miffy Greer said. This is just what we do. AISA has also been fortunate in the leadership of Dr. Peter Bateman in the past 10 years. Peter came into this position with the task of moving the organization into the 21st century, particularly with regard to technology. Peter didn't do all this alone, as much as we appreciate his talents. He had very, very active and supportive boards who worked with him in the past 10 years. And he's also had a great team around him sort of putting things together. So can I ask Peter to stand up and his team? So guys, give us a big wave. For those of us who were present in the old days, just a glance at the AISA website today and a look around the organization of this very conference, it is clear that a giant leap has been made into the future. Congratulations, Peter, AISA boards, and school planning committees who have supported AISA's growth. If you have been a part of a school planning committee for an AISA conference or AISA activities, would you stand up? I think there are probably many of you in the room. School planning committees for AISA. As with everything in AISA, it's a community project. Most of all, in the process of writing this book, what I realized is that AISA is not one story, but hundreds of stories related by everyone who was part of the organization from the beginning. This is why we solicited stories from you, our members, and the book is replete with memories and experiences that you had in association with AISA. This is what has made the book as rich as it is because of people like you who have been the very life force of the organization. I'd like to thank all of the members who contributed stories and photos from your own experience for the book. If you haven't already, when you look through the book, the stories that were submitted are printed on brown pages in the book. So you can, if you don't want to read the rest of it, you can just flip through and see what people have said. I'd also like to thank our publisher, John Catt, and particularly our editor who was assigned to this project, Jonathan Barnes, who is not with us today, but he was infinitely patient and supportive and encouraging as we went along. And Alex Sherratt is here on behalf of John Catt. I don't know if Alex is here tonight. Maybe not. But there he is. Okay, great. Thank you, Alex, on behalf of all of us, and please pass along our thanks to John and the others. As an aside, and on a personal note, please indulge me for a minute as I relate some personal vignettes that have meant so much to me and have colored my attitudes toward Africa. I first went to Ethiopia with my young family in 1975 during the Ethiopian Revolution, shortly after the arrest of Tafari Makonnen, also known as Emperor Haile Selassie. While it was a historic time, it was also a tumultuous, tragic, and frightening time, as revolutions are. While in Tanzania in 1994, I went out and bought a small TV so I could watch the historic inauguration of Nelson Mandela on May 10th. I loved being in Tanzania to watch this event, even more so, as Mandela emerged from 27 years in prison, not with vengeance on his mind, but rather reconciliation. And he worked hard to ensure a peaceful transition to majority rule after the brutal years of apartheid. I fear we may never see his like again. Meanwhile, back in Tanzania, a former teacher, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, was an early and reliable supporter of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. During his tenure as Tanzania's first prime minister and president of the republic after independence, he then went on to become the driving force behind the creation of the Organization of African Unity. He was unassuming and lived simply. He was the first African president to facilitate a peaceful transfer of power by voluntarily vacating his office in 1985. He then became a much revered elder statesman. November of 2008 found me living in Kenya. On the day of the presidential election, I was invited by the US ambassador for breakfast to his residence, together with hundreds of Kenyan and international dignitaries, as well as students from local schools. We milled around the expansive gardens of the ambassador's house that cool Kenyan morning, and large TV screens had been set up around the garden where the presidential election results from the United States were beaming live. The students were holding notebooks and clipboards and counting up electoral college votes as they came in. Before the election was even called, some students had already done the math and anticipated by a few minutes the official announcement that Barack Obama had been elected the first African-American president of the United States. With his ancestral roots in Kenya, he was something like a rock star there, and still is. And his election sent a thrill through the garden even as cheers went up from the crowd. I will never forget that moment. As all of you also do, I have so many other warm memories of magnificent sunrises and sunsets, adventurous holidays with my children, Shelley and Nigel, and later on holiday from the Peace Corps, my future daughter-in-law, Shoshana, joined us too. I remember those hours in vibrant African cities, along muddy rivers and rainforests, but most especially in the magical East African game parks. I hold them in my heart. These are just a few of the images that will be with me for the rest of my life. But I need to stop with the memories now before you fear it will take up the rest of your life listening to them. A couple of years after I retired, I had the opportunity to go to Japan to be the acting director of the American school there for a year. Never having had the slightest interest in Japan up to that point, I had a lot to learn about that fascinating country. While there, I came upon the concept of wabi-sabi, which, as with so much in Eastern philosophy, has no direct translation into English. However, I believe I was able to understand that it means something as follows. Ideas that I think can apply to all of us within AISA during this 50th year of its existence. First and foremost, all things are impermanent, incomplete, and imperfect. Therefore, perfection is impossible, and imperfection is the natural state of everything, including ourselves. I don't know about you, but this really lets the pressure off. Reviewing the 50 years of AISA's development, I see that nothing was ever complete. Things were so often improvised, and regardless of how hard we tried, it was and remains imperfect. In Japan, simple objects such as a pottery bowl may become cracked or chipped with use and age. Rather than replace the bowl, it will often be patched and used and reused. It does not become less value because of the damage, but more valued and appreciated as an object that reflects the passage of time and the beauty that comes with change, like the passing of the seasons and age. This also lets the pressure off of us aging folks. Finally, the concept of wabi-sabi would encourage us to remember the past, but not to hold on to it or sink into a pit of nostalgia, but accept it for what it was, for all the good and the bad, and also accept that the past is gone, as it should be. Irene Epp said it better than I can in her interview that is quoted in the end of the book. AISA's big strength through the years is its adaptability. Through many challenges, the organization has maintained its human connection, its innovative spirit, and its strong sense of identity. The challenge going forward will be to remember the past without sentimentality and stride boldly into the future with its great heart. By the way, as you may have already guessed, that one young woman sitting on the stoop of her apartment in Washington, D.C. in 1969 was me. I was awaiting the birth of my first child, who was born on November 27th, my daughter Shelley. Shelley, thanks for helping me edit the book, and apologies for having just announced to a room full of people that you're about to turn 50. Happy birthday, AISA.